Harlem was suffocating that afternoon, the air thick with heat and tension. The streetlights flickered lazily as if the sun itself had grown too tired to shine. The pulse of the city slowed, but not for long, not when Bumpy Johnson moved through it. Bumpy walked with the kind of calm that made the world around him stop, whether he wanted it to or not. His suit was sharp enough to cut through the summer haze, his presence colder than the city's hottest streets. He was Harlem. People didn't just respect him, they moved out of his way. When Bumpy strolled by, the crowd parted like water before a ship. A man of power, he didn't need to ask for it. It was simply given. Beside him, his wife, elegant, poised, was every bit the queen people whispered about. She didn't need to speak for respect. Her silence commanded it. They weren't just a power couple, they were a dynasty. As they made their way past the Apollo Theater, Bumpy barely noticed the kids in their flashy clothes hanging out of a cherry-red convertible, tourists from the Upper East Side. The kind who thought Harlem was a playground for their entertainment. They were loud, overconfident, the kind of rich kid who thought he could say anything without consequence. But there's a difference between money and respect. And these boys had neither. The leader, Julian, stood up and yelled, "This place is a joke, just a bunch of fruit stands and old women going to church." His voice was obnoxious, the kind of voice that comes from someone who had never felt a real punch. His friend Trip tried to pull him back. "Julian, you don't know who's around here," he warned, eyes darting nervously. But Julian laughed, not caring. "Please, these people work for us, Trip, we own them." He was already looking for someone to prove him wrong, and then he saw Bumpy. There he was, Bumpy Johnson, walking through the crowd like a shadow in daylight. Julian didn't see the king of Harlem. He saw a challenge. He saw someone who, in his twisted mind, needed to be put in his place. "Who's that?" Julian asked, his voice slurring slightly from the bourbon. "He walks like he owns the sidewalk." Trip froze, his face drained of color. "Oh God, Julian, let's go. We need to get out of here." But Julian wasn't listening. "Now I'm gonna say hello," he said, stepping away from the car with a cocky smirk. Trip didn't follow, he knew better. Bumpy felt the disturbance in the air before he heard it. The music from the record store dropped in volume. The chatter from the corner turned to silence. His wife, sensing it too, tightened her grip on his arm. "Keep walking, sweetie," Bumpy whispered, his voice calm, steady, as if this was just another part of his day. But Julian didn't know what he was stepping into. He swaggered over, blocking their path like he was in charge. And for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The tension thickened. The game was set. But who would make the first move? Julian, too drunk on his own arrogance to notice, stepped right into the lion's den. Julian stood there, smirking, taller than Bumpy, his chest puffed out like a rooster. He was used to being the biggest person in the room, but here in Harlem, he was just another fool in the wrong place. "Excuse us, son," Bumpy said, his voice smooth, dismissive, like he was talking to a kid who forgot to take his shoes off inside. He tried to guide his wife around Julian, but the kid wasn't moving. He stood there like a wall, blocking their path. "I'm not talking to you," Julian sneered, turning his full attention to Bumpy's wife, giving her a slow, leering look. "Nice suit. My father's butler wears one just like it." Bumpy didn't blink. The entire street felt like it was holding its breath. Even the vendors selling their ice, their fruit, their lives, they froze. Julian was used to making people flinch, used to making people uncomfortable. But Bumpy didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge the comment. "Is that right?" Bumpy said. "Well, your father has good taste." His tone was soft, polite, but every word felt like a warning. Julian leaned in closer, his breath reeking of bourbon and bad decisions. "You think you're someone, huh? Walking around like you own this place. And her." He looked over at Bumpy's wife again, his voice dripping with contempt. "What, you think she's a queen or something? She's a streetwalker dressed up in Sunday clothes." The words dropped into the air like a stone, heavy, chilling. For 3 seconds nothing happened, not a sound, not a breath. Then slowly Bumpy released his wife's arm. He didn't shout. He didn't make a fist, he didn't even blink. His body, still and unshaken, shifted just enough to tell anyone watching that something had changed. The polite businessman was gone. The predator emerged. Julian waited for Bumpy to react. He expected a fight, expected a show. He didn't get that. What he got was worse. Much worse. Bumpy's eyes turned flat. No warmth, no pity, just a cold, calculating stare. "What did you call my wife?" Bumpy asked, his voice as calm as ever, but this time it was a snake coiling. Julian's smirk faltered. His bravado shriveled as he saw the look in Bumpy's eyes. I just... Julian stammered, trying to regain control of the situation, but Bumpy wasn't giving him an inch. The crowd around them began to shift, slowly pulling back. A few people turned their heads, not out of curiosity but out of instinct. They knew what was coming, and they knew they didn't want to be anywhere near it. Bumpy took a single step forward, closing the gap between them, not fast, not angry, just deliberate. Julian felt the world tilt, his bravado suddenly feeling like an anchor around his neck. Bumpy didn't move like a man about to fight. He moved like a man who knew the fight was already over. "Do you think that's funny?" Bumpy's voice was low, steady. "You think you can stand here, in front of my wife, in front of my people, and disrespect her? What do you think is going to happen?" Julian opened his mouth, but no words came out. He could feel the heat rise in his chest, the alcohol turning into cold sweat. "Move," Bumpy said. He didn't need to shout. His voice had the weight of a man who wasn't asking for respect, he was taking it. Julian stepped back, stumbling, his legs shaking as Bumpy and his wife tried to walk past. But before they could, Julian moved again, blocking their way. The street seemed to close in. The noise of the world outside disappeared. Bumpy didn't look back at him. He didn't need to, but Julian didn't know what was coming next, and neither did the rest of the street. Bumpy stopped again, but this time he didn't even look at Julian. He just felt the shift in the air, the tension thickening, a knot tightening around his neck. The crowd was gone now, replaced by a suffocating silence that even the sun seemed to bow to. Julian had no idea what he had stepped into, but he was about to find out. "You still here, kid?" Bumpy's voice was cool, like a man discussing the weather, but underneath it was a quiet storm that had already begun to churn. Julian swallowed hard, still trying to puff himself up, but the words stuck in his throat. He had no backup, no tricks, no way out. Bumpy's eyes never left him. "Tell me something," he said, his voice just above a whisper, but the street heard it loud and clear. "What's your name?" Julian blinked, caught off guard. He wasn't used to being asked. He was used to commanding attention, not being interrogated. "I'm Julian," he said, his voice wobbly now, his bravado draining out of him with every passing second. Bumpy took a step closer, invading his personal space with such precision that Julian's breath caught in his chest. "Julian," Bumpy repeated, testing the name like it didn't belong to a person, just a pawn. "You're not from around here, are you?" Julian's eyes darted around. He wanted to turn and run, but his feet wouldn't move. I'm just here with friends," he stammered, his voice cracking. Bumpy raised an eyebrow, the flicker of a smile barely visible. "Friends? You came to my street and you thought you could just talk like that to anyone, to my wife." Julian's heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't the plan. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to be the one in charge. "You think you can walk up here," Bumpy continued, "and play games with me, with my people, with my wife?" The silence grew thicker, like it was suffocating him, pinning him down with invisible hands. The world was watching now, but Julian was too deep in his own panic to realize it. The crowd, the vendors, the regulars on the corner, they weren't just spectators, they were witnesses, and every one of them knew that Bumpy Johnson didn't have to prove anything. His name, his reputation, that was all the proof he needed. Bumpy looked at Julian, sizing him up like a chess piece about to be moved. "I know what you're thinking," he said quietly. "You think you've got time. You think I'm not gonna do anything. But you're wrong, Julian. You stepped on the wrong street, and now you're going to learn why you don't disrespect my family." Julian's hands started shaking. The alcohol was wearing off, but the fear, that was just starting to set in. He looked around, but the streets were quiet. His friends were nowhere to be found. The convertible was gone, the sound of the engine a distant memory. Bumpy took another step forward, closing the gap between them. He wasn't angry, wasn't even yelling. He didn't need to. "You're gonna remember this, kid," he said. "You're gonna remember who you disrespected, and you're gonna wish you never set foot on my block." Julian tried to speak, to say something, anything to shift the power back to him, but no words came out. He was trapped. The streets had already made their decision, and as Bumpy took a step back, it was clear that Julian wasn't in control anymore. The game was set. The consequences already on their way, but it wasn't over. Not yet. The worst part was still to come. Bumpy straightened, his posture shifting, his eyes colder than before. The game wasn't over, not by a long shot. The street was still holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Julian felt it, the weight of it all. The realization that the man standing in front of him wasn't just a gangster. He was the law of this place, a law that didn't care about money or status. This was Bumpy's world, and Julian had just stepped on the wrong side of it. "Here's the deal, kid." Bumpy's voice was calm, but it was also final, like the verdict was already passed. "You got a lot to learn, and you're gonna learn it the hard way. I could break you right here, end it all, and make you disappear, but that wouldn't teach you anything. It wouldn't make you understand what happens when you disrespect me." Julian's knees were shaking now. He couldn't even hold his head up. He had expected a fight, expected some kind of showdown, but this wasn't a showdown. This was a lesson in survival. Bumpy's eyes narrowed, and for a second Julian could see the man underneath the suit, the predator who had survived everything life had thrown at him. The streets, the jail time, the violence. Bumpy had seen it all, and he had come out the other side stronger than ever. And now Julian was his next lesson. "You've got two choices, Julian," Bumpy said. "You can walk away. You can forget this ever happened and pretend you're the same rich kid who runs around doing whatever he wants. Or," Bumpy paused, his eyes locking onto Julian's, "I can show you what happens when someone crosses the line in my world. And trust me, kid, that second option. It's gonna change you. It'll break you down until you don't even know who you are anymore." Julian's throat tightened. He wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to escape this, but he couldn't move. The weight of Bumpy's words pressed down on him, crushing every ounce of defiance left inside him. "Don't get me wrong," Bumpy continued. "You're not gonna die today. I'm not gonna waste my time with someone who's too stupid to know when to shut up. But you're gonna remember this, Julian. Every time you look in the mirror, every time you put on your fancy suits, every time you try to buy respect with daddy's money, you're gonna remember what happened here." Bumpy leaned in closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "And when you do, you'll know exactly who you're not." Julian swallowed hard, his hands still trembling. He couldn't take it anymore. His mind was racing, trying to come up with something, anything, to make this stop. But there was nothing he could say that would change the game. The rules were set, the consequences already written. Bumpy straightened, and in that moment Julian realized just how small he was. Not physically. He was still bigger, younger, more built, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. He was nothing compared to Bumpy. A boy playing dress-up in a world that didn't belong to him. "You've been a nuisance, Julian," Bumpy said, his voice returning to that casual, dismissive tone. "But I'm a man of my word. I'm gonna let you go, for now. But don't think this is over. Don't think you've been let off easy." Julian's mind spun. The relief was almost too much to handle. He thought maybe, just maybe, this was the end of it, that he was free. But then he heard the sound. It was quiet at first, a single soft tap against the concrete, but then it grew louder. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, and they were coming closer. The footsteps grew louder, each one echoing off the alleyway walls like a countdown. Julian's pulse raced. He couldn't see who was coming, but the heavy thud of boots told him it wasn't anyone here to save him. It wasn't a cop, it wasn't a friend. Bumpy didn't even flinch. He stood there like a man who had already won the fight, already written the end of the story. But Julian's heart was slamming in his chest. His mind screamed for him to run, to find a way out, but every muscle in his body was frozen. The door at the far end of the warehouse creaked open slowly. The faint outline of a figure appeared, moving with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "Zip," Bumpy said, his voice just above a whisper. The man in the doorway stepped forward, a tall, quiet shadow, his face unreadable. Zip didn't speak. He didn't need to. Bumpy glanced at him, then back at Julian. "You thought you were getting off easy." Bumpy's words dripped with quiet menace. "You thought a couple of threats were enough to make this go away." Julian's breath hitched. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He was sweating now, his hands slick with fear. The figure in the doorway stepped closer, and now Julian could see his face, stone cold, like a man who had never smiled in his life. Zip moved like a predator, not rushing but sure. He walked toward Julian, who recoiled instinctively. He wanted to back away, but his body refused to obey. He couldn't even stand up straight. His legs were jelly. "I don't care if your daddy's got more money than God," Bumpy continued, his eyes cold. "You think money makes you untouchable. Money doesn't protect you in my world. It doesn't stop people like Zip from making a decision. And it doesn't stop me from deciding who lives and who gets to walk out of here." Julian's breath came faster, his chest tight with the weight of what was happening. Zip was almost beside him now, and Julian could feel the heat of his presence, the sheer weight of the man's silence. The air felt like it was closing in on him, suffocating him. Bumpy took a step back. "You were about to leave here with nothing but your dignity, but I think you need more than that. I think you need a reminder, a lesson, something that'll make sure you never walk into this neighborhood again thinking you can run your mouth." Julian finally found his voice. "Please," he gasped, his words coming out in a frantic rush. "Please, I'm sorry, I was drunk, I didn't mean it. I'll never." Bumpy raised a hand, cutting him off. His eyes were unblinking, unwavering. "It's too late for sorry, kid. You can't buy respect. You can't talk your way out of this." And then Zip moved. Not fast, but it didn't need to be. He was already standing in front of Julian, his hand coming down like a vice on the back of Julian's neck, pushing him down onto his knees. The terror in Julian's eyes was plain as day now. It wasn't just the fear of physical pain, it was the realization that he was nothing here, that he had no control. Bumpy didn't move. He just stood there, watching, waiting. He didn't need to do anything else. The street was already watching, the city was already listening. They all knew what happened when someone thought they could step on Bumpy Johnson's turf. Julian's mind raced, but there were no more excuses. He was trapped and the game was already over. Bumpy took a final, deliberate step forward. "You thought you were untouchable. Let me show you what happens to people who think like that." The air in the warehouse shifted. The sound of a distant siren echoed in the streets, but there was no escape for Julian now. He was trapped, and Bumpy was the only thing in the world that mattered. The silence in the warehouse grew heavy, suffocating. Julian's breath came in short, panicked gasps as Zip's hand pressed harder on the back of his neck, forcing his head down. The cold concrete felt like a furnace beneath him now, the world spinning around him. He was trapped in a nightmare with no end in sight. Every muscle in his body screamed to fight, to lash out, but his legs were like stone. His arms hung uselessly by his sides. He was paralyzed by fear and the weight of what was happening, of what was about to happen. Bumpy's eyes never left him, the steady gaze of a man who had seen everything life had to offer and still stood tall. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even disappointed. He was just calm. And in that calm, there was a depth of power that Julian had never understood. Power that didn't need to shout or show force because it was already ingrained in the world. "You called my wife a streetwalker," Bumpy said again, his voice low, controlled. "Do you understand what that means?" Julian's mouth was dry, his throat tight. He couldn't speak. He couldn't even look up at the man standing in front of him. All he could do was nod, barely, like a child caught stealing cookies from the jar. "You know who I am, Julian." Bumpy's voice was like a blade sliding across stone, sharp, precise, cutting through the fear. "I'm the king of Harlem. I'm the reason the streets keep turning. People like you, people from your world, they come here thinking they can buy their way through, thinking they can disrespect people like me, like her." He gestured toward his wife standing behind him, her presence a quiet strength. "But you can't buy respect. You can't take it, and you sure as hell can't demand it." Julian's head dropped lower, his body shaking with the weight of Bumpy's words. "I didn't mean it," he finally managed to croak, his voice cracking. "I swear to God I didn't mean it. I was just drunk, I. Bumpy held up a hand, cutting him off with a single motion. He didn't need to hear it. He'd already made his decision. "Get up," Bumpy said, his tone almost too casual for the moment. But Julian's legs were too weak, too shaky to obey. He tried, but his body didn't respond. Zip, still looming over him, gave a single tug, pulling Julian to his feet like a rag doll. The boy's knees buckled, but Zip held him steady, lifting him back up to eye level with Bumpy. "There's a price to pay for disrespect," Bumpy said. "And that price isn't something you can pay with money or apologies or any of the things you thought you had. It's a price you pay with your soul." Julian's eyes widened. He opened his mouth, but the words died in his throat. Bumpy smiled, but it wasn't a smile of kindness. It was the smile of a man who had already won. "But you're not going to die tonight," he said. "You're not going to leave here with your dignity either. What you'll leave with is a lesson, something that'll stick with you for the rest of your life." Julian's mind raced. He didn't understand. What was Bumpy going to do? How much further could this go? His heart pounded, and all he could do was stare at the man in front of him, waiting for something, anything, to give him an out. But there was no out, not here, not now. Bumpy turned his head slightly, just enough for Zip to understand the unspoken command. Zip stepped back, and Bumpy reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, gleaming object. Julian's eyes flicked to it in panic. It was a switchblade. The cold gleam of it in the dim light was enough to freeze the air in his lungs. His throat constricted. No one said a word, not Bumpy, not Zip, not the shadows in the warehouse. But Julian knew he was about to face the price of his arrogance. The weight of his actions was about to come crashing down, and he didn't know if he could survive it. The blade gleamed under the harsh light, and for the first time since walking into Harlem, Julian felt the crushing reality of where he was. His mind scrambled, racing for a way out, but his body was locked in place. The sweat on his forehead was cold, the taste of fear thick in his mouth. Bumpy didn't move for a second. He just looked at the knife, his eyes narrowed as if considering the weight of the moment. The silence was thick, pressing down on Julian like a vice. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. "You're not leaving here with anything," Bumpy said quietly, his voice a low growl. "But maybe, just maybe, you'll leave here with something more valuable than your pride." Julian could feel the air around him tightening, his pulse racing, his heart hammering in his chest. Every inch of his body screamed for him to run, to break free, but his legs wouldn't obey. His mind was paralyzed by fear, by the overwhelming presence of the man in front of him. "See," Bumpy continued, his voice still calm, still calculating, "there are lessons in life that money can't buy. And there are moments that will make you wish you'd never been born, that you could erase the mistake you made, take back every word you said, every action you took." Bumpy's eyes met Julian's, and for the first time Julian understood the depth of power Bumpy wielded, understood why people feared him. Bumpy wasn't a man to be trifled with. He was a force of nature, a man whose presence demanded obedience, whose reputation was built on more than just violence. And Julian, he had just made the mistake of thinking he was untouchable, that his money, his last name, would protect him from consequences. But it was. And now, in this cold, dark warehouse, Julian was about to learn just how deep the consequences ran. Bumpy took a step closer. The blade was still in his hand, but it wasn't pointed at Julian. Not yet. Instead, Bumpy held it casually, almost like a tool. It was the control he had over the situation that was the real weapon. "You're going to walk out of here, Julian," Bumpy said softly. "But you're not going to walk out the same way you came in." Julian's breath hitched. His mind was spinning, unable to catch up with the sudden shift. His heart pounded in his ears, the words coming out of Bumpy's mouth too surreal, too final to process. "You'll remember this moment every day. Every time you look in the mirror, you'll remember. And that's the punishment," Bumpy continued. "Not death, not the easy way out. You're going to live with this." The air was thick with tension. Julian was shaking now, not from the cold, but from the realization that he was being broken down in ways he didn't understand, ways he never expected. And then, just as suddenly as the tension had arrived, it shifted again. Bumpy stepped back, his posture straightening. He didn't need to say more. The lesson was complete. Bumpy nodded to Zip and the man moved, his large form stepping aside to reveal the door. "Get him out of here," Bumpy said, his tone still ice cold. "Take him back to his world." Julian couldn't move at first. His legs felt like they were made of lead. He was still processing what had just happened, what he'd just been a part of. The room felt like it was closing in on him, but Zip didn't wait. He grabbed Julian by the collar, yanking him toward the door. Julian stumbled, his legs barely able to hold him up, and he was pushed through the door and out into the night. The chill of the air hit him immediately, but it wasn't enough to clear his head. He could barely comprehend what had just transpired. He looked back once, back at the warehouse, back at Bumpy, back at the life he had thought he controlled, and he realized the truth. He was nothing, a pawn in a game he didn't understand. And as the cold night air surrounded him, the full weight of his failure came crashing down. Bumpy had let him go, but Julian wasn't free. He was already a ghost, a walking lesson in why arrogance had no place in Harlem. And he didn't even know yet what the real price would be. The night swallowed Julian whole as Zip shoved him into the back of the black sedan. The car door slammed shut, and the sound of it echoed in his ears like the final toll of a bell. For a moment, the world outside the car was just a blur of shadows, neon lights, and the soft hum of tires against asphalt. He was alive. He was breathing. But the truth weighed heavy on him like a shroud he couldn't shake. Zip didn't say a word. He just sat there, his silence a force as oppressive as the dark city streets outside. The kind of silence that made you feel like your entire existence was fading into the background. Julian tried to steady his breath, but the tightness in his chest wouldn't let up. He couldn't even bring himself to ask the question that was burning at the back of his throat. Why? Why had Bumpy just ended it? Why hadn't he finished him off in that warehouse? Why had he let him walk out alive? He wanted to scream, but his voice was trapped somewhere deep inside, a mixture of fear and disbelief. All he could do was stare at the passing streetlights, the city now feeling like a prison. His body ached with humiliation. His pride was shattered, and every inch of him felt exposed, raw, vulnerable. The car rolled down the streets of Harlem, the neighborhood Bumpy owned, a place that felt both foreign and suffocating. There was no escape. No matter how far Julian went, no matter how much money his father had, this place, Bumpy's world, would always be one step ahead of him, always watching. "Stop," Julian croaked, his voice weak, barely audible above the engine's rumble. He wasn't sure if Zip even heard him, but the car slowed to a stop anyway. The headlights cut through the dark like twin blades, casting long shadows across the empty street. The door creaked open, and Zip gestured for him to get out. For a moment, Julian froze, his hand gripping the door handle. His legs felt like jelly. He wanted to protest, to demand that Zip take him somewhere, anywhere, but he knew it was pointless. He was already on the edge of something much worse than death. "Get out," Zip said again, his voice low, unbothered. Julian slowly climbed out of the car, his mind still spinning. The weight of everything that had happened was too much to process, too overwhelming. But one thing was clear. He was standing on the edge of a precipice, and no matter what he did now, he was never going to be the same. The car door slammed shut behind him. The heavy iron lock in his chest clicked into place. He looked around. The street was quiet. The buildings loomed above him, their cold faces reflecting the streetlights like eyes watching his every move. The distance between the car and the heart of Harlem felt like a lifetime. He took one step forward, then another, but his legs were unsteady. His heart was still racing, his mind scrambling for some kind of answer, something that could explain what had just happened. But there was no explanation. No easy out. Julian turned back once, hoping, no, praying, that he could still find something to hold on to, something to remind him of the life he once thought he had. But Bumpy was gone. The warehouse was gone. And everything that had happened, every lesson, every drop of blood and sweat was already a part of him, forever. The streets of Harlem felt like a maze. There were no straight paths, no exits, just corners and dead ends, each one leading deeper into the unknown. And as Julian took another shaky step, he realized something. The lesson had only just begun. "Julian," Bumpy's voice echoed in his mind. "You'll remember this." And he would, every single day. Every time he looked in the mirror, every time he walked into a room full of people who had no idea what he'd done, who'd never understand the price he paid. He was alive, but he was already dead. The night stretched on, thick and heavy, like the fog rolling in off the river. Julian stumbled down the street, his steps dragging, each one heavier than the last. His body was exhausted, his mind reeling from the night's events. But there was no rest for him, not now, not ever. He had crossed a line, and the weight of that decision was only starting to sink in. He walked aimlessly, trying to put some distance between himself and the hell he just walked out of. But the city, the streets of Harlem, they had a way of swallowing you whole, of making you feel like you were never really in control. They always found a way to remind you of your place. Julian's thoughts kept circling back to the same question. Why did Bumpy let him go? He had expected a beating, expected the worst. He had been ready for it, but what he got instead was far worse. He had been broken down, humiliated, not physically, but in a way that would stick with him for the rest of his life. The shame of it. The way Bumpy had looked at him, like a child who didn't know his place in the world. "Remember this, Julian," Bumpy's words echoed in his mind, taunting him like a dark melody. "You'll never forget this." He could feel it already creeping under his skin. The weight of what he had done to Bumpy's wife, the insult he had thrown at her at them. The worst part wasn't the apology, hell, that was easy. The worst part was knowing that he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He had made himself a target in a game he didn't even understand. And what scared him the most? He knew he would never be able to shake it, not from his soul, not from his bones. He looked around, trying to make sense of the city that was slowly closing in on him. The streets seemed endless, the buildings towering above him like giants in the dark. He could hear the hum of traffic in the distance, but it felt like a million miles away. He was alone. That's when he saw them. A group of figures standing in the shadows up ahead, silhouetted by the dim streetlights. He couldn't make out their faces, but he could see their eyes. Watching. Waiting. Julian's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the weight of their gaze, the pressure mounting in his chest. His first instinct was to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. His body was numb, paralyzed by the uncertainty of what was about to happen. He took a hesitant step forward, his eyes locked on the figures in front of him. One of them stepped forward, his silhouette sharp against the night. The figure was tall, his posture rigid like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Julian's breath hitched. He knew who this was. He knew exactly who it was. "Julian Vanderhaven," the man's voice rang out in the quiet night. It was cold, detached, with a hint of something darker beneath. "You've been making a lot of noise around here, talking to people you shouldn't be talking to, disrespecting people you shouldn't be disrespecting." Julian's throat went dry. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His chest tightened with fear. His mouth was dry. He was in no position to argue, no position to run. The weight of his mistakes, of everything, was finally crashing down on him. The figure took another step forward, and the dim light revealed his face. It was Zip, the same Zip who had stood in the warehouse, silent, calculating, the same Zip who had dragged Julian out of the darkness and into a reality he couldn't escape. "You think you're safe now, don't you?" Zip's voice was low, menacing. "You think Bumpy let you go because he's merciful? Nah, kid. He let you go because he wants you to suffer. He wants you to live with this. Live with the fact that you thought you could walk into his world, make a mess, and walk out without consequences. But it's not over. Not by a long shot." Julian's breath caught in his throat. "Please," he begged, the word barely a whisper. "Please, I didn't mean it. I'm sorry. Zip's cold laugh interrupted him. "Sorry. That's what you don't get, Julian. Sorry doesn't change a thing. You'll remember what you did. We all will. You made a choice, and now you'll live with it." Julian's eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but the figures behind Zip moved closer, surrounding him like a cage closing in. He was trapped, and the game Bumpy had started was only just beginning. Before he could react, Zip nodded. The figures behind him closed in, and the darkness around Julian grew heavier, colder. There was no turning back now. "Take him," Zip ordered. The words were final, a sentence. The figures moved without hesitation, and in that moment Julian understood. He was a prisoner now, not in a cell, not in a warehouse, but in his own shame. And there was no escape from that. Julian didn't even try to fight back. He didn't have the strength, the will, or the energy left to put up a struggle. The figures around him moved with efficiency, their grip cold and unforgiving as they pulled him through the dark streets. Zip walked behind them, his eyes locked onto Julian's every move, every breath, as if he were an animal being herded into a cage. The city seemed to blur around them, the sounds of traffic, of late-night revelers, of life, all fading into a background hum that might as well have been the distant murmur of a dying world. Everything felt muted, like he was moving through water, drowning in the weight of his decisions. The further they took him into the night, the more isolated he felt. He couldn't see where they were going, but he could feel the city changing around him. The streets became quieter, the lights dimmer, the air colder. Finally, they stopped. The place was unremarkable, the kind of spot that didn't get much foot traffic. An alley tucked between two crumbling buildings, barely visible under the weak glow of a flickering street lamp. The kind of place no one would look twice at unless they were looking for something or someone. Zip stepped forward, pulling open a rusty door that creaked in protest, the sound sharp and jarring in the otherwise silent night. He looked over his shoulder at Julian, his expression cold, unreadable. "Inside," Zip said, his voice like ice. Julian felt his body go cold with dread, his feet unwilling to move. This was it. He had crossed the line. He had been marked, branded, and now there was no more room for mistakes, no more room for apologies. Two of the figures behind him shoved him forward, their hands pushing him through the door and into the darkness. The room inside was dim, lit only by a single hanging bulb that cast long, twisted shadows across the concrete floor. It smelled like old wood, dust, and something else, something metallic, something cold. Julian's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded as he tried to adjust his eyes to the darkness, but the more he looked around, the less he understood. This wasn't just some random warehouse. This was a place that felt like it had history, like it had seen things Julian wasn't ready for. Zip stepped in after him, followed by the other figures, all standing still, watching, waiting. Then from the back of the room, a figure emerged from the shadows. Bumpy. Julian's stomach dropped. He had thought he'd left Bumpy behind, thought the worst was over. But this was the worst. Bumpy was in charge here in this room, in this place. The air around him seemed to pulse with quiet, lethal energy. "You've made a mess, Julian," Bumpy said, his voice low, but carrying with it an undeniable authority. "A mess you can't clean up, and now we're going to see if you've got enough left to face it." Julian opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to plead, but nothing came out. The weight of Bumpy's words crushed him. "You thought I let you go because I was done with you," Bumpy continued, his eyes narrowing. "But you're wrong. You're here for a reason, kid, and that reason isn't mercy. It's reality. You needed a lesson, and you're going to get one. I told you earlier, there's no going back." Julian felt a wave of nausea roll through him. He was trapped. There was no escape. He had made the fatal mistake of thinking he could walk through Harlem untouched, untouchable, and now the price was being collected. "I told you that you'd remember this. Now you're going to learn what that means." Bumpy stepped forward, the shadows shifting as he moved, his presence filling the room like a storm gathering on the horizon. "Take a seat, Julian," he said softly, but it wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. The tension in the room thickened. Julian's legs shook, but he did as he was told, stumbling toward a chair in the center of the room. The cold metal seat felt like a trap, but it was the only option left. Bumpy's eyes stayed on him, never leaving his face. There was no anger in his gaze, no fury, just an unblinking, cold calculation. He was watching Julian like a chess master, waiting for the game to play out. Julian sat, his body stiff with fear. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything, trying to find a way out, but it was useless. There was no escape from the web Bumpy had spun around him. And then, just as Julian thought he might break under the pressure, Bumpy spoke again, his voice calm, deliberate. "You're going to remember this, Julian," Bumpy said. "Not just for a day. Not just for a year, for the rest of your life." The darkness around them seemed to close in, the weight of Bumpy's words sinking into Julian's skin, his bones. The game wasn't over yet, and Julian was about to lose it all. The seconds stretched into minutes. Julian's pulse thudded in his ears, and every muscle in his body was on high alert. He sat motionless, his eyes fixed on Bumpy, watching the man with a calm demeanor that was more terrifying than any shout, any threat, any promise of violence. Bumpy didn't rush. He never did. He took his time, letting the tension in the room build like the pressure before a storm. His eyes moved around the room, not focused on Julian, but surveying everything, the shadows, the figures around him. He was assessing the space, measuring every inch, every move. Julian's throat felt dry. His mind was still racing, trying to come up with a way out, but there was no escape. Not this time. "You're not the first one to walk through that door thinking they could talk their way out of this," Bumpy said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "But you're going to be the first one to learn a lesson that's going to stick with you for the rest of your life." Julian swallowed hard, the lump in his throat nearly choking him. His eyes flicked nervously to the men in the room, the figures that stood silent and still, watching him like hawks. There were no words, no sympathy. Just cold, hard eyes. Bumpy walked around him slowly, the sound of his shoes against the concrete echoing in the stillness. Julian couldn't keep up with the movement. He tried to focus, tried to keep his head from spinning, but everything about the room, the oppressive darkness, the quiet murmurs of breathing, was designed to break him. "You know why you're here?" Bumpy asked suddenly, his voice a low murmur. Julian's heart jumped in his chest. He nodded, but Bumpy didn't give him a chance to speak. "Because you thought you could walk into my world and disrespect me, my people, my wife, like it was some game," Bumpy continued, each word weighed down with the gravity of truth. "You came here with that arrogance, that entitlement, that privilege. You thought the streets would just bend for you, that your last name would protect you. But I'm the one who owns these streets. I decide who walks, who falls, who learns." Julian clenched his fists in his lap, the tightness in his chest unbearable. He couldn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. His whole life had led him to this moment, and every choice, every mistake had brought him here. Bumpy stopped in front of him, close enough now that Julian could feel the weight of his presence, the depth of his authority. The man's eyes didn't show anger, but something much colder, disappointment. "You think you can apologize your way out of this, don't you?" Bumpy's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "You think if you say the right words, everything will be okay. But that's the thing about people like you, Julian. You think the world revolves around your money, your status, your connections. But the streets don't care about that. The streets don't care who your father is. The streets only care about one thing, respect. And you disrespected me. You disrespected my wife." Bumpy's eyes hardened, and Julian felt a chill run through him. The cold, calculating gaze locked onto him, and he knew in that moment that Bumpy wasn't just a man who ran Harlem. He was the embodiment of it. He was its heart, its soul. "Do you understand that?" Bumpy asked, his voice like steel. Julian couldn't breathe. He nodded quickly, trying to gather himself to make sense of everything that had just been said. But he was drowning in it, drowning in the weight of his own arrogance, his own mistakes. "You've been given a chance," Bumpy said, stepping back, his gaze still locked on Julian. "But that doesn't mean you're free. You don't get to just walk away from this. Not yet. You still have something to learn, a price to pay, and this lesson." Bumpy smiled, the expression sharp and knowing. "This lesson will stick with you long after tonight. It'll haunt you, Julian. Every time you look in the mirror, you'll remember what happened here." Julian's heart sank. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He was trapped, suffocating under the weight of everything that was about to happen. Bumpy turned his back to him and gave a subtle nod to Zip. Without a word, Zip stepped forward, his hand reaching for the chair next to Julian. Julian flinched, his body instinctively jerking back. But Zip didn't move to hurt him. Instead, he grabbed a small, plain object from the table nearby, a set of handcuffs. Julian froze. He couldn't even process what was happening. He just watched, paralyzed, as Zip moved behind him, locking the cuffs around his wrists. The cold metal felt heavier than anything he had ever experienced. He was no longer in control, not of the situation, not of his own fate. Bumpy turned back to him, his eyes dark and intense. "You're gonna sit here for a while. You're gonna think about what you've done. And when I come back, maybe, just maybe, you'll understand what it means to disrespect someone like me." With one last cold glance, Bumpy turned and walked toward the door. Zip followed, the sound of their footsteps fading as the door closed behind them. Julian was left in the darkness, alone in the quiet with only the sound of his own breath for company. His wrists ached, the cuffs biting into his skin. But it wasn't the physical pain that consumed him. It was the realization that he wasn't just a prisoner here. He was a prisoner to the lessons that had just begun. Time stretched in the dark, the silence in the room thick with anticipation. Julian sat there, the cold concrete beneath him and the handcuffs digging into his wrists, forcing him to stay grounded in this moment. The minutes ticked by, slow and oppressive, and his thoughts felt like a whirlpool, pulling him deeper into the darkness of everything that had led him here. He couldn't escape it. There was no easy way out, no way to erase what had just happened. His father's face flashed in his mind, cold, calculating, distant. The conversation on the phone had been brief, detached. He hadn't been concerned with Julian's safety, only with protecting his empire, his image. The realization hit Julian harder than anything Bumpy had said. His father wouldn't come for him. Not this time. The money, the power, all of it, it meant nothing here. Not when it came to respect. Not when it came to Bumpy Johnson. He shifted uncomfortably, trying to find some way to ease the pressure in his chest, but there was no relief. He wasn't just physically trapped by the cuffs or the room. He was trapped by his own choices, the mistakes he'd made, the arrogance that had driven him here. Every step he had taken from that convertible to this moment had been a step towards something much darker, and now he was facing the consequences. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing, but the images kept flashing in his mind. The look in Bumpy's eyes, cold, calculating, disappointed. That quiet authority, the way Bumpy had looked at him like he wasn't even worth the energy of a full threat. He thought about the insult he had thrown at Bumpy's wife. The way those words had come out like they were nothing, like they didn't matter. But now they hung in the air like a curse, lingering over him. He had disrespected a woman who had stood by a man like Bumpy Johnson, and that was something you couldn't take back. And that, Julian realized, was the crux of it. Respect. The streets didn't care about your last name or your money or your education. They cared about respect. And in that moment, he understood that Bumpy wasn't just teaching him a lesson about power. He was teaching him the value of respect, the price of disrespect. The door creaked open. A sliver of light cut through the darkness, and Julian's heart jumped in his chest. He wasn't sure how long he had been sitting there, but the sound of footsteps told him Bumpy was back. The door opened wider and Zip stepped into the room first, his cold eyes scanning the space before locking onto Julian. The large man didn't say a word. He just stood there, looming like a shadow, his presence as heavy as the silence. Then Bumpy walked in, his suit sharp even in the dim light, his face unreadable, cold. He stopped just in front of Julian, standing tall, his posture as calm and assured as ever. Julian swallowed, the fear rising again in his chest. His mouth was dry, his mind racing with what Bumpy might do next. "Time's up," Bumpy said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of finality. "You've had enough time to think, to stew in your mistakes, but now it's time to face the consequences." Julian tried to speak, to say something, anything, but his throat closed up. He couldn't find the words. Bumpy crouched down in front of him, his eyes level with Julian's, and for a moment the two men were face to face in that silent, charged space. "You think you can walk away from this?" Bumpy said, his voice like a whisper but cutting through the air with the sharpness of a blade. "But you can't. Not now. Not after what you've done." Bumpy leaned in just slightly, his voice dropping even lower. "You insulted my wife. You disrespected me, but you don't get to just apologize and walk away. You're going to live with this, every day, every moment, until you understand what it really means to disrespect someone like me." Julian's breath hitched, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of every word Bumpy had spoken, each one pressing down harder than the last. He thought he could get away with it. He thought he could be the one in control. But now he knew. The streets, Bumpy, they didn't forget. And they didn't forgive. Bumpy stood up, his gaze still locked on Julian, watching him with a mix of cold calculation and something else. Something that might have been disappointment, but it was buried beneath the weight of his authority. "You'll walk out of here tonight," Bumpy said, turning toward the door. "But you're never going to forget what happened here, and I'll make sure of that." He turned and nodded to Zip, who moved forward, unlocking the cuffs and pulling Julian to his feet with a force that made him stumble. "Go on," Zip said, his voice as hard as steel. "You're free to go, but remember, kid, the real price of your mistake hasn't even started to hit you yet." The door opened and Julian was shoved out into the cold night. The world outside felt unfamiliar now, like he was walking in a place that was no longer his own. But as he stood there, staring down the empty street, the weight of what Bumpy had said settled in. "You're never going to forget." And Julian understood. This was his life now, a life of consequence, a life of lessons learned the hard way. The streets didn't care about who he was, where he came from, or what he had. All they cared about was respect. And tonight, he had learned just how much it cost. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. And he wasn't sure if he would ever be the same. But Bumpy had made sure of one thing. Julian Vanderhoven wasn't going to forget who he was. Not ever again. And that, he realized, was the true punishment. The cold wind bit at Julian's face as he stood on the sidewalk, his body still adjusting to the shock of what had just happened. The streetlights flickered above, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. He could hear the distant hum of traffic, the life of the city continuing around him, indifferent to the storm that had just torn through his world. He should have been relieved. He had walked out of that warehouse alive. But there was no relief, only emptiness. The world he had known, his world of privilege, of power, of connections, had crumbled. Everything that had mattered to him, everything that had given him his sense of self, had been stripped away. He was no longer the young man who walked the streets with a sense of invincibility. He was just a man who had made a terrible mistake. And there was no going back. His mind raced, replaying every word Bumpy had said, every moment that had led him to this point. The words echoed in his head, like a loop that he couldn't escape. "You think you can walk away from this? You think sorry fixes everything?" Bumpy had been right. He had crossed a line, one he couldn't uncross. He had thought he could come to Harlem and talk his way out of anything. But now he knew better. The world didn't work like that. The streets didn't care about his last name, his money, or his father's influence. The streets cared about respect. And Julian had learned that lesson the hard way. He pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders, trying to shield himself from the cold. But the chill wasn't just in the air, it was in his bones. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, his feet dragging as if the weight of the night had rooted him to the ground. He wanted to scream. He wanted to lash out at something, at anything, to release the anger and frustration boiling inside him. But there was no one to scream at. There was no one left to blame, not even his father, who had never bothered to show up when it mattered. Julian was alone in this, trapped in a reality he had never thought he'd have to face. A few blocks down, he saw a cab pull up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the darkness. He hadn't planned on taking a ride, didn't even know where he was going, but he found himself walking toward it almost without thinking. He needed to be somewhere else, anywhere else. The driver didn't ask questions when he slid into the backseat. Julian didn't offer any explanation either. The city stretched out before him, the bright lights of the skyscrapers seeming so far away, like another world. "Where to?" the driver asked, his voice gruff but uninterested. Julian stared out the window for a moment, the lights blurring as they sped past. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care. All he wanted was to be as far away from Harlem as possible. But something told him that no matter where he went, the streets would follow him. The weight of what he had done would always be there, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. "Just drive," Julian finally said, his voice empty, as hollow as he felt. The cab sped off into the night, the city's heartbeat still pulsing in the distance. But Julian knew it wasn't the city he was running from. It was himself. As the cab weaved through the streets, Julian's mind kept drifting back to the warehouse, to the lessons Bumpy had taught him, the lesson that would follow him forever. He had crossed a line that night, and he would never be able to forget it. But even more than that, he had learned something else, something that struck deeper than any punishment. He had learned the price of power, and the price of losing it. He had learned that in the world of Harlem, respect was everything. And now, more than ever, Julian understood what it meant to have none. The cab's engine hummed on, but Julian's world had already stopped. The city blurred past the window, but Julian didn't see it. His mind was miles away, trapped in the endless loop of regret, shame, and the deepening realization that his life was no longer his own. He had been a boy who thought he could conquer anything with money and power. Now, he was a man who had learned that nothing, not even his last name, could protect him from the consequences of his actions. The cab's engine hummed steadily, but Julian felt as if the world around him had come to a screeching halt. Every mile felt like an eternity. Every streetlight that passed was like a reminder that he couldn't escape the truth. That night in the warehouse, the humiliation, the lesson, it would stay with him, haunting him like a ghost. No amount of money, no luxury, no status would erase what had happened. The cab finally slowed to a stop, and the driver's voice broke through the fog in Julian's mind. "Where to?" Julian didn't answer immediately. The words didn't seem to matter. His whole life, his world, felt distant, like he was staring at it through a glass. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care. All he wanted was to get away from the place that had just torn him apart. He didn't want to be in Harlem, in the city that had chewed him up and spat him out. But something told him that no matter where he went, the lessons he had learned would follow him. The guilt, the fear. "Just drive," he muttered, his voice thick with exhaustion. He didn't even look up. He couldn't. His thoughts were too heavy, too dark to focus on anything else. The city rolled past him, a blur of lights, people, and noise, but Julian was trapped in his own mind, his own thoughts. He thought about his father, the man who had failed him at every turn. He had been hoping for a savior, for someone to come to his rescue, but instead, he'd been abandoned in the most vulnerable moment of his life. His father, a man who could move mountains with money and influence, had done nothing. Nothing. Julian stepped out of the cab when it stopped, the cold air greeting him like an old enemy. He handed the driver a wad of cash, more than enough to cover the fare. He didn't even check. He couldn't care about anything anymore. It wasn't about money now. It was about something deeper, something darker. He stepped onto the sidewalk, disoriented, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. He stood there for a moment, just breathing, trying to make sense of the world around him. The city, his city, seemed so vast, so full of life, but he felt like an outsider, as if he were looking at everything through a window. It wasn't his world anymore. He had lost his place. The respect he had once taken for granted, the life he had once thought he owned, gone. He looked down at his hands, still feeling the cold metal of the cuffs even though they were no longer there. His wrists ached, but it wasn't the physical pain that hurt. It was the truth that gnawed at him. The streets had won. The lessons Bumpy had taught him had taken root deep inside, and now they were a part of him. He turned, not sure where he was going, but needing to move, to put some distance between himself and the painful weight of everything. His legs felt heavy, each step a reminder of how far he had fallen. Hours passed, and the sun began to rise over the city. The streets, which had been dark and quiet, now began to fill with life again. The hum of the city returned, people walking, cars honking, the world turning as if nothing had happened. But for Julian, everything had changed. The city was still the same, but he was. As he walked, he thought about what Bumpy had said, about how he would remember. It wasn't just the humiliation, it was the realization of what he had lost, what he had given up when he had crossed that line, the respect he had taken for granted, the arrogance that had driven him. It had all cost him, and there was no easy fix for that. But as the city began to come alive around him, something stirred in Julian. A quiet, unexpected shift. He wasn't running anymore, not from the lessons, not from the streets, not from himself. For the first time, he understood what it meant to earn respect, to fight for it, to prove that he was more than just his money, his last name, his father's influence. He wasn't sure how he was going to do it or what the road ahead would look like, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't the same person who had stepped into Harlem that night. He had been broken, but that didn't mean he couldn't rebuild. The road ahead would be long. It would be difficult. Every day he would be reminded of what had happened. But Julian knew that now he had to learn the real price of his mistakes, and he would live with that price for as long as it took. He stood there watching the sunrise, feeling the city's pulse, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Julian felt something shift inside him. Maybe, just maybe, he had a chance to make it right. The end.